Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. Thank you so much for all of the new subscribers that have come on to all the platforms, and also everyone that's shown love to the episodes and clips on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and Instagram. It's really been heartwarming how many people out there either need this information, have been seeking it, or just, following it. I had somebody ask me the other day, given the first 4 or 5 episodes of this podcast, what made me go so deep into this. Like I said in the initial episode of this series, it was just filling in the gaps for myself and then finding this wealth of knowledge just sitting there that I had not learned in school because of the political situation, and I wanted to enlighten myself, and I found these people and instances and events very interesting, and doing the research then became writing about it, putting it together, getting my sources together, and really then putting it out here for you to consume. Once again, if you haven't subscribed, please do so on the platform that you're listening to the full podcast or wherever you follow us on our socials. Make sure to like and subscribe wherever you are. Throughout the first couple of episodes, I have mentioned certain people, but not really dug into who they were and if there was a significance from that perspective to the colored community today. There is, and therefore I'll be digging into them specifically and just laying out who they were, where they came from, what freedoms or restrictions they had, and which surnames are the roots of these people in South Africa and were pulled through into the colored community. The Freeburgers are a group that I have mentioned a couple of times. They are former company, VOC company employees, mostly soldiers, sailors, and craftsmen who were released by the VOC service and granted land to farm, but still had to adhere to the VOC's laws and authority. Jan van Riebeeck released the first group of company servants to become free workers. His thinking was that he would reduce the costs to the VOC by allowing ex-employees to grow food for the VOC and the settlement rather than getting it from other colonies or from the Netherlands. So who were these men mostly? This group was made up mostly of Dutch men, later included Germans, Scandinavians, and some French Huguenots, which is the group that I'll talk about next. They also included a small number of free slaves, and I think we spoke about free blacks last week with regards to the groups of people that own slaves. So they had freed slaves that lived with them, and I even spoke about it in the Gritoa episode. These freed blacks or freed slaves were released and they were allowed to live with the Freeburgers, so they became part of that group, but they faced more social and legal restrictions as they do. These Freeburgers often married women from diverse backgrounds, including European settlers, freed slave women, and local Khoi or San women, forming part of the early mixed ancestry community. I think we've spoken about that quite a bit. So what freedoms did they have? They could own land. At first they leased it from the VOC, and then they later were sold it outright. They could trade in certain goods locally, which is grain, vegetables, wine, and meat. They could marry freely, though racial prejudice influenced social acceptance. They could pass their land on to the heirs. They could hire labor, whether that was enslaved people or Khoi servants. And they could move to outlying areas, specifically as trekboers in the 1700s. Have you ever heard about trekboers? This was the first time I heard about this concept. I know about the voortrekkers, because that was drummed into my head at school, but I'd never heard of this concept of the trekboer, so had to obviously look at it. So it says the trekboer were nomadic, semi-isolated pastoralists. So they were like Khoi people at Boere. Yeah. who migrated inland from the Cape Colonies over the centuries, while the Voortrekkers were organized groups of European settlers who undertook the Great Trek in the 1830s and 80s, driven by specific political and economic grievances with the British rule and seeking to establish independent states in the interior. So the key difference between the trekboer and the Voortrekker was that the trekboer was individual or family-based migration and their more isolated lifestyle compared to the Voortrekkers, which was like large amounts of people, organized groups, and later more specific migrations during the 80s and 1840s, okay? So one was, I'm just moving my family, or I'm just moving myself somewhere and I'm going to find somewhere that I can graze my cows. That's what I'm going with. And then the Voortrekkers were like this large groups of people that just got together, got in their wagons, and then like went somewhere that they could set up a whole new village and a whole new settlement for themselves. So that's really the key difference. Now you know. The Freeburgers had restrictions, which was odd. They could not freely trade with foreign ships. So the VOC had a monopoly on major exports and imports. They could not own large tracts of land without the VOC permission. They hired pieces of land that they could farm on, and then they could provide that produce to the VOC. But they couldn't own bigger lands if they wanted to. They could not leave the colony without a pass. Found that very interesting. They were subject to VOC courts and laws. They're required to sell their produce to the VOC at fixed prices when needed. This is grain, wine, and meat. In wartime, they could be called up for militia duty to defend the settlement. You know, when I say those things, first things that come to mind is like Star Wars to defend the Empire. I don't know if anybody else, it's the same thing. Sorry, my brain makes connections it's not okay. The long-term significance. The Freeburger system created the first permanent non-company European settler community in South Africa. It set the stage for the trekboer migrations into the interior, which in turn laid the roots of the Boer republics in the 19th century. The early intermarriages with free slaves, Khoi, and Asian women also contributed to the emergence of the coloured community at the Cape. I said this last week that creation of this community was really the foundation of the society, the language, religion, and culture. The surnames, I said, that were passed on through both white and coloured lines. We'll just speak about that now. So through the Afrikaner or coloured overlap. So the surname exists in both. Skluter, Fourie, Leroux, Van Westhuizen, Potgieter, Collin, Duplessis, Milan, and Lombard. Predominantly coloured origin, but with some branches, is from Van Bengali, Van der Kaap, De Koning, and Van Malabar. Those are generally people that you can see that came from those markets in Batavia, and they ended up here with those surnames. They predominantly takes care of the coloured branch. The French Huguenots were Protestants who followed the teachings of John Calvin in France. So after the Edict of Nantes, they enjoyed limited religious freedom in Catholic France. When the edict was revoked in 1685 by King Louis, blah, 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 through the Edict of Fontainebleau, this revocation made being a Protestant illegal in France, leading to persecution, imprisonment, and execution, confiscation of your property, and bans on Protestant worship. Many fled to Protestant-friendly regions like the Netherlands, England, Switzerland, and some to the Dutch Cape Colony. So why did they come to the Cape? You're looking at France, all those other countries seem so much closer, whereas if you wanted to come to the Cape, you had to get on a boat and take that boat for a long time to get here. The Dutch East Indian Company saw these guys as valuable, so they lured them here with promises of lands and seeds and livestock that they would be able to own. They were skilled wine growers, farmers, and artisans, and they shared the Reformed faith with the Dutch. Between 1688 and 1700, about 150 to 200 Huguenots arrived at the Cape. So what were they given? They were given land grants in Drakenstein, Franschhoek, and Stellenbosch. They were given tools, seeds, and initial livestock. There's a story that some of these Huguenots smuggled some vines with them into the Cape, but I didn't really look at that further than what I've heard. What were their privileges? They were given Freeburger status, even though they weren't VOC employees, so they could farm and trade privately. It's very important if you're coming here. They were often given the most fertile land in key agricultural areas. I mean, when I said Drakenstein, Franschhoek, and Stellenbosch, you understand why I said they were given the most fertile lands. They were allowed to worship in the Reformed tradition, whereas in France, their religion was now illegal. They initially had tax exemption to help with cattle, and they were given support by the VOC. There were certain restrictions placed on them. In 1701, the VOC ordered that Dutch be used in school and official affairs. This meant they had to assimilate themselves into the Dutch colonial society. And by the mid-1700s, French as a language had largely disappeared at the Cape. Why did they do that? It would have made my life so much easier if it was somewhere. They were not allowed to form an independent political unit. They could not freely trade beyond VOC-approved routes and prices. They were limited in their trade. They had to join the Dutch Reformed Church, so they couldn't have an independent French Reformed Church. That's very important and why the language probably died over time. Land grants required them to remain productive and loyal to the VOC. The Huguenots quickly integrated into the colonial labor system, which really means that they were exploitive towards indigenous people. They imported slaves and basically followed the VOC's, the vibe. For the Khoi and the San, the Khoi were hired as herders or farm laborers because they were the pastoralists, but this was often coercive and payment could be in goods, not wages. Again, sometimes alcohol, dop system. I know I haven't put in something up about that, but yeah, it's a lot I had to consume and I want to put it out properly. So hopefully this week I get to it. So San hunter-gatherer communities often resisted colonial intrusion. The Huguenot farmers took part in frontier conflict and commando raids against San groups accused they got slaves from Madagascar, Mozambique, India, and Indonesia, nothing different from what the VOC was using. Those slaves were used in the vineyards and orchards, wheat farming, and animal husbandry. I had never heard this before. And then domestic service, of course. Some Huguenots became wealthy wine farmers. No shit, Sherlock. Largely because of the availability of slave labor. So what is the Huguenots' legacy? The wine industry in Cape Town. Franschhoek became a major wine producing area and still is. The Afrikaans language, which absorbed some French words in a very weird way too. I can't even mention the two that I know off the top of my head because the English words are rude. But they say a pampoen and kujavel. Okay, I've not heard that in French. The white settler elite that expanded colonial land holdings at the expense of Khoi and San territory. There are several documented cases of French Huguenots at the Cape who married local women, freed slaves, or women of mixed ancestry, and whose descendants became prominent in South Africa, particularly within the coloured community and broader settlement society. Many Cape coloured family trees contain French surnames such as Duplessis, Milan, Leroux, Dutoit, because of these early unions. It was really funny when I was trying to firstly look at the Freeburgers specific people that they gave, that I found as examples of people that got married, and then that led to the surname passing down in South Africa. And really, really hard from a Freeburger perspective to find any kind of reference to these people. Then when I started looking at the French Huguenots and the local ladies that got married, it was still hard, but there were so many, like Jean Leroux or Pierre Lombard. There's a lot of people still with the same first names and surnames from that period. And also, it was more detailed records at that stage than there was initially. Now that really gives us the ability to trace our mixed ancestry roots. And I think you'll agree, all the surnames that I just mentioned are also very prominent in the Afrikaner community today, because my husband being French, when Afrikaners meet him, like, oh, my fun is France, you know? And they're very like proud of that connection. This influence really gives us genealogical diversity of both the coloured and the Afrikaner population, because we have this blending of this heritage that we're pointing to. So this was in the Cape. When people were moving, like the trekboer and eventually the voortrekkers, they took their slaves with them, or their workers, that says their workers with them. There is a story that I saw at the slave lodge who speaks of a guy named Hermanus Matruas who settled in the Eastern Cape. Slavery wasn't concentrated in the Eastern Cape as it was in the Western Cape, but it did have that ripple effect into those communities. As I mentioned, when settlers started expanding, moving eastward, tensions with the Xhosa-speaking groups intensified. These conflicts are known as the frontier wars, partly driven by the colonists' demand for labor and land. The encroaching colonial community and warfare disrupted the political system, social cohesion, and food security of the Xhosa-speaking groups. Many of the slaves escaped the slaveholders during the course of the 17th century and made their way to the Eastern Cape, where they were incorporated into the Khoikhoi and the Xhosa society. Robert Ross points out that during a visit to Chief Hintze in 1809, Colonel Collin found that a large number of people who lived with the chief's main settlement were deserters from the Cape Colony, including slaves. Many had Khoi wives living with them. Hermanus Matruas's father was a slave who had escaped from the Cape Colony and taken refuge at Amaxhosa and married a woman from Amajwara clan. Sorry, I hope I'm saying that right. Hermanus learned Dutch, probably from his father, and also while working on the farm near Somerset East. He became fluent in Dutch and isiXhosa, and also learned English. It's always amazing that people that set out this way. On leaving the farm, he went through initiation and became part of the Xhosa, and he later served as an interpreter for the British as well as for the Xhosa leader. He enjoyed the status of counselor and also used as an interpreter by some of the colonels during the Battle of Grahamstown. Matruas prospered because he understood the Xhosa better than the Englishman and perhaps the British better than the Xhosa. Matruas was an active ally of Makoma, who was fiercely opposed to the British occupation of the land of the Amaxhosa. and led the Matruas in war resistance against the British in 1834, 1846, and 1850, and is regarded as one of the greatest military commanders of the Matruas. While leading an attack on Fort Beaufort in 1851, Hermanus Matruas was shot and killed. I think the big learning here is that these guys escaped from where we were in the Cape, and they integrated into the communities they found in the Eastern Cape that were not colonized so that they could have their freedom. We've spoken in the last episode a lot about the lessons, and the lessons here are very similar. I'm going to go through them as we end of this episode, and I hope you've enjoyed this information. It's just always so important to talk through where and how we became this huge mix of people and this diverse group and mixing that we see today in South Africa. Our lineage wasn't only shaped by pure European lineage, but by this cultural fusion, adaptation, and resilience. The foundational genetic and cultural link between early European settlers, the Freeburgers, the Huguenots, and the ancestors of the coloured community. It is quite strong. Because there was mainly men in the beginning, a lot of those men were having relationships and getting married to enslaved women from Asia, Africa, and Madagascar, and the indigenous Khoi and San women. The Huguenots were Protestant refugees. They quickly integrated into the Dutch Reform Society, but the persecution history gave them an empathy towards the marginalized groups in South Africa. Didn't stop them from using people as slaves. I can't speak to how someone was feeling at that stage, but it didn't mean that they were giving those people equality, but there was an empathy that existed there that influenced how some Huguenots are related socially and economically to non-European groups. The shared experience of displacement can sometimes bridge cultural divides, though unfortunately colonial context and power imbalances still prevailed. But it's very important to understand that context and where that connection could have come from. The Freeburgers established farms, often with labor from enslaved people and indigenous workers, creating an economic interdependency between European settlers and non-Europeans. They couldn't build, they couldn't farm, they couldn't do these things without those communities because there weren't enough of them here. And that's what the Huguenots found when they came here too. So the wealth creation in the Cape was tied to this cross-cultural cooperation under equality. Again, the language, this cultural blending of all these people bringing their languages, the French of the Huguenots, the Malay, the Portuguese, the Creole spoken by the slaves, and the Dutch enforced by the VOC, built this language, which is this living record of that cultural blending and survival, which I've mentioned before. Even though the social and racial story after this doesn't get better over time, as we will find out as we get to those portions that my family experience, that I experience, and how we experience South Africa today. The cultural resilience and the cultural mixing at that stage, from blending these multiple worlds, created the beauty that I see in my country today. And I know it's not all sunshine and roses. I know we have ways to go, but I can still take a moment And I can still admire how far we have come and what we have learned and how the past still echoes through our lives every day. Thank you so much again for joining us. We had another lighting change because life happened. I hope you guys have had a great day. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Come back next week when we get to speak about all the the rebels, the guys who went against the system, and we get to take a moment to talk about them and what they did, and a lot of the times whether they survived or not. But during that time, there was never a time, and that was important for me going through that list of descents, that people stood still. Like and subscribe, and see you all next week. Thank you. Mwah, mwah, mwah.